The history of the Second World War is often painted in broad strokes. We see the massive armies colliding on the Eastern Front, the armadas of ships approaching Normandy, and the fleets of bombers darkening the skies over Germany. These are the stories of the visible war. But there was another war. A war fought in the whisper of a radio transmission, in the scratch of a forged pen, and in the terrifying silence of a moonless night. It was a war where a single mistake didn't just mean death, it meant disappearance. No grave, no letter home, just a file stamped missing presumed killed. Tonight, we are going to walk in the footsteps of one such ghost. We are going to declassify the operation of Captain Elias Thorne, a man who ceased to exist the moment he stepped onto a plane in 1943. This is not a story of glory. It is a story of cold, calculating fear, and the immense courage it takes to operate alone in the heart of the Nazi Empire. Welcome to the shadows. To understand Elias Thorne's mission, you must first understand the man. Before the war, Thorne was not a soldier. He was an architect in Chicago. He understood structures, stress points, and blueprints. That is exactly why the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, recruited him. They didn't need a trigger puller. They needed a man who could look at a German bunker and see not just concrete, but a puzzle to be solved. His training began not in a boot camp, but in the misty, isolated estates of the British SOE in Scotland. There, amidst the heather and the rain, he was stripped of his American identity. He learned how to pick a standard Wehrmacht lock in under 30 seconds using a piece of piano wire. He learned how to kill a man with a rolled-up newspaper. He learned the art of gray man tradecraft, how to walk into a room and be instantly forgotten, how to look at a German officer with just the right amount of fear and stupidity to avoid suspicion. By the winter of 1943, the training was over. The target was identified. Deep in the coastal town of St. Malo, inside a requisition chateau, the total organization, the engineering group responsible for the Atlantic Wall, was hiding the schematics for a new type of reinforced submarine pen. If the Allies invaded, they needed to know the thickness of that concrete. Thorne's mission was suicide by any statistical measure. Infiltrate the chateau, photograph the blueprints, and get out. The insertion method was the first test of his nerve. It was a moonlight sonata. A Westland Lysander, small, agile aircraft painted entirely matte black, flew him across the English Channel at treetop level. The flight was a nauseating ordeal of turbulence and tension. Thorne sat in the rear, clutching a small canvas bag. Inside was his life, a silenced well-rod pistol, a forged ration book, a compass sewn into the buttons of his coat, and a Leica 3C camera modified for low-light document photography. The pilot didn't speak. He simply flashed a red light. That was the signal. Thorne opened the hatch. The wind roared like a beast. Below, France was a patchwork of deadly darkness. He jumped. The landing was hard. Thorne hit the frozen earth of a plowed field, rolling instinctively to disperse the impact. The silence that followed was heavy. He lay there for 10 minutes, not moving a muscle, listening. Was that a dog barking? Was that the rumble of a truck? When he was sure he was alone, he buried his parachute. He took a handful of pepper dust from his pocket and scattered it over the burial site to confuse the German sniffer dogs. He then rubbed mud on his face and hands. From this moment on, Captain Elias Thorne was dead. In his place stood Henri Dubois, an itinerant carpenter looking for work. The walk to St. Malo took 3 days. He slept in barns, burrowing into the hay to escape the biting cold. He ate raw turnips stolen from fields. Every step was a calculation. He avoided the main roads, sticking to the goat paths and ancient Roman trails that crisscrossed the region. On the second day, he encountered the enemy. A German motorcycle patrol had stopped by a stream. 2 soldiers were laughing, smoking cigarettes, their MP-40 submachine guns resting on the handlebars. Thorne was hidden in a hedgerow, less than 10 feet away. He could smell the tobacco smoke. He could see the condensation of their breath. His hand drifted to the well-rod pistol in his pocket. The weapon was a marvel of British engineering, a bolt-action .32 caliber pistol with an integrated suppressor that made it quieter than a hand clap. But firing meant noise, bodies, and an investigation. So he waited. He waited for an hour until they finished their break and rode off. This was the discipline of the spy, patience above action. St. Malo was a cage. The Germans had turned the historic city into a fortress. Checkpoints were everywhere. Thorne's contact was a woman named Claire, a waitress at a dockside cafe known to be frequented by collaborators. The meeting was fraught with danger. Thorne walked in, ordered a bitter chicory coffee, and placed a specific brand of cigarettes on the table. Claire walked by, wiped the table, and whispered a single sentence. "The cleaning crew enters at noon." She slipped a small key into his hand under a napkin. It was the key to the service entrance of the chateau. The night of the infiltration, the weather turned. A storm blew in from the Atlantic, lashing the city with rain and sleet. This was good. The sentries would be huddled in their boxes, their visibility reduced. Thorne approached the chateau, de la Duchesse Inn. It loomed like a monster in the dark. He found the service door. His hands were shaking from the cold, making it hard to grip the key. He took a deep breath, centering himself. "Focus, Elias." Just like the training, he inserted the key. It turned with a smooth, oiled click. He was inside. The chateau smelled of floor wax, old wood, and the stale scent of German tobacco. He moved through the service corridors, wearing the blue overalls of a janitor he had stolen from a clothesline earlier that day. He carried a mop and bucket as props. If anyone saw him, he was just the cleaning boy. He reached the main office on the second floor. This was the lion's den, the office of Oberst Colonel Muller. Thorne picked the lock of the office door. Inside, the room was dominated by a large oak desk and a heavy steel safe. He didn't have the combination, but the OSS had given him a stethoscope. He pressed the diaphragm of the medical instrument against the cold steel door of the safe and began to turn the dial. He closed his eyes, blocking out the world, listening for the microscopic clunk of the tumblers falling into place. Left to 40. Click. Right to 12. Click. Left to. Footsteps. Thorne froze. The footsteps were heavy, the distinct sound of jackboots on parquet flooring. They were coming down the hall. They stopped right outside the door. Thorne looked around frantically. There was nowhere to hide. The window was barred. The desk was open underneath. He scrambled under the desk, curling his tall frame into a tight ball, praying to a god he hadn't spoken to in years. The door opened. The light from a hallway spilled in. A flashlight beam swept the room. "Did you leave the window open, Hans?" a voice asked in German. "No, Herr Major. I locked it." "It feels drafty. Check it." Boots walked across the room, inches from where Thorne was hiding. He could see the polished black leather. He could see a speck of dried mud on the heel. He held his breath until his lungs burned. If he coughed, if his stomach rumbled, if he shifted his weight, it was over. The soldier checked the window, rattled the latch, and walked back. "It's closed, sir." "Gut. Let's go. Schnaps is waiting." The door closed. The lock clicked. Thorne didn't move for 10 minutes. He let the adrenaline subside, his heart slowly returning to a rhythm that wouldn't kill him. He crawled out, sweating despite the freezing room. He returned to the safe. He found the combination. The door swung open. Inside were the blueprints. Atlantic Wall, Sector B biplane. He pulled out the Leica. He didn't have a flash. It would alert the guards outside. He had to use a long exposure. He set up the camera on a stack of books. He held his breath to minimize vibration. Click, wait, click. He turned the page. Click, wait, click. He photographed every inch of the documents. 20 minutes of agonizing precision. He returned the files, locked the safe, and slipped out of the room. He was a ghost again. But getting in is only half the mission. Getting out is where most agents die. As he exited the service door, disaster struck. A guard he hadn't seen was standing in the alcove, sheltering from the rain. They bumped into each other. The guard, a young boy really, looked startled. He raised his rifle. "Halt. WRDA. Who is there?" Thorne didn't hesitate. He didn't try to talk. He lunged. His left hand grabbed the barrel of the rifle, pushing it up, while his right hand drove a combat knife he had concealed in his sleeve into the guard's side. It was brutal, intimate, and silent. The boy slumped into Thorne's arms. Thorne lowered him gently to the ground, whispering a meaningless apology into the rain. There was no time for guilt. He dragged the body into the bushes and ran. The escape route was compromised. The dead guard would be found at the next shift change in 20 minutes. Thorne couldn't walk out of the city. The alarm would sound before he made the perimeter. He needed a vehicle. He found a delivery truck parked near the mess hall. It was a risk. The noise of the engine could wake the dead, but he had no choice. He hot-wired the ignition, a trick he learned from a safecracker in London. The engine coughed and roared to life. He drove slowly toward the checkpoint. He wore the dead guard's helmet and greatcoat, hoping the rain and the dark would hide his face. As he approached the barrier, the sentry stepped out, raising a hand. Thorne slowed down, rolling down the window. "Papers!" the sentry shouted over the storm. Thorne leaned out, keeping his face in the shadow of the helmet. "Emergency dispatch for Colonel Muller. Partisans spotted near the coast road," he shouted in flawless, frantic German. The sentry hesitated. The mention of partisans and the urgency of the request confused him. Psychological manipulation was Thorne's best weapon. "Open the gate, you idiot, or I'll report you for delaying a command dispatch." The sentry, terrified of disobeying an order, cranked the handle. The barrier rose. Thorne gunned the engine and sped through. He watched the rearview mirror until the checkpoint lights faded into the darkness. He ditched the truck 5 miles down the coast and ran toward the extraction point. It was a rocky cove known as Dead Man's Drop. He stood on the edge of the cliff, flashing his torch. 3 short, 1 long. Beethoven's Fifth. V for victory. Below, in the churning black water, a shape emerged. An RAF high-speed rescue launch. A dinghy was sent out. Thorne scrambled down the rocks, his body bruised, exhausted, and freezing. As he climbed into the boat, the sailors wrapped him in a wool blanket and handed him a flask of rum. He took a drink, the burning liquid feeling like life itself returning to his veins. He looked back at the coast of France. Somewhere in the darkness, alarms were ringing. Men were shouting, but the secrets of the Atlantic Wall were safe in the roll of film in his pocket. Elias Thorne's mission was a success. The intelligence he gathered that night allowed Allied bombers to target the weak points of the submarine pens with tallboy earthquake bombs months later. But Thorne never saw the victory. He was redeployed 2 weeks later to Norway, and then to Berlin. He survived the war, but he left a part of his soul in that rainy courtyard in St. Malo. This is the reality of the shadow operations. It wasn't James Bond. It wasn't glamour. It was a lonely man in a stolen coat, shivering in the rain, fighting a war with a camera and a lockpick. The extraction from St. Malo was not the end of the war for Captain Elias Thorne. It was barely an intermission. In the world of shadow operations, survival is not a reward. It is simply a qualification for the next, more dangerous assignment. Thorne spent exactly 3 weeks in London. 3 weeks of debriefings in smoke-filled rooms, drinking lukewarm tea while men in tweed suits analyzed every decision he had made in France. The photographs he had taken of the Atlantic Wall blueprints had revealed a critical weakness, but they had also revealed a name, a signature on the bottom of the engineering drafts, Dr. Victor Cross. Cross was the mastermind behind the German advanced guidance systems. Intelligence indicated he was no longer in France. He had been moved to the industrial heartland of the Third Reich, to the city of Essen in the Ruhr Valley. The mission profile shifted from reconnaissance to extraction. Thorne wasn't just going to take pictures this time. He was going to steal a man. The insertion for Operation Iron Foundry could not be a parachute drop. The Ruhr Valley was the most heavily defended airspace in Europe, a forest of flak towers and searchlights. To get in, Thorne had to walk in through the front door. His new cover was crafted with obsessive detail by the forgery department at Section 5. He was no longer a French laborer. He was now Eric Visser, a Swiss industrial efficiency consultant from Zurich, traveling to Germany on a legitimate, albeit falsified, trade visa. This cover was high risk. High-status covers attracted high-level scrutiny. His clothes were tailored from Swiss wool. His suitcase was expensive leather, and his pockets contained a gold lighter and packet of authentic Swiss chocolate. Bribes for the lower ranks, conversation starters for the officers. The journey began on a train from Basel, crossing the border into Germany. The tension was different this time. It wasn't the raw, animal fear of jumping out of a plane. It was a slow, suffocating pressure. At the border checkpoint, Thorne stood in line. The German border guards were efficient, cold, and thorough. The guard who took Thorne's passport didn't just glance at it. He held it up to a magnifying glass, checking the grain of the paper and the specific curvature of the stamped eagle. Thorne leaned against the counter, projecting an air of bored arrogance, checking his watch as if he had important meetings to attend. "Your business in Essen or Visser?" the guard asked, not looking up. "Steel production analysis." Thorne replied in crisp, neutral German with a slight Swiss intonation. "The Reich requires efficiency. I am here to ensure the quotas are met." The mention of quotas and Reich was calculated. It framed him as a collaborator, a businessman profiting from a war. It made him despicable to some, but acceptable to the establishment. The guard stamped the passport. The sound of the stamp hitting the paper echoed like a gunshot in Thorne's mind. He was in. Essen was a vision of hell. The Allied bombing campaigns had turned the city into a skeleton of blackened brick and twisted steel. The air tasted of sulfur, pulverized concrete, and wet ash. People didn't walk, they scurried, eyes downcast, clutching their ration cards. Thorne checked into the Hotel Kaiserhof, one of the few hotels still standing. His room was cold, the windows taped over to prevent shattering from shockwaves. He unpacked his gear. The tools of the trade had changed. No Sten gun this time. It was too bulky. He carried a Mauser HSC pistol, a German weapon that wouldn't look out of place if found, and a commando knife sewn into the lining of his coat. But his most important weapon was a small, innocuous-looking notepad. It contained codes hidden in the seemingly random sketches of machinery parts, a technique known as steganography. The contact was a woman named Hilda, a secretary at the Krupp Steelworks who was secretly feeding information to the underground. The meeting place was a cinema showing a propaganda film. In the darkness, amidst the flickering images of smiling German soldiers, Thorne took the seat next to her. They didn't look at each other. "The package is being moved," she whispered, pretending to cough. "Cross is at his villa in Bredny, but he is not alone. The SD, the Sicherheitsdienst, is watching him. They suspect he is losing his nerve." "How many guards?" Thorne asked, his eyes fixed on the screen. "4 inside. A patrol car outside. He leaves for the factory at 7 o'clock. He returns at 1900 hours. The villa has a cellar. The air raid siren is your clock." She slid a piece of paper into his pocket, a floor plan of the villa. Thorne waited 10 minutes after she left before he moved. The plan relied on the one thing that was guaranteed in the Ruhr Valley, the Royal Air Force. Every night, like clockwork, the British bombers came. The chaos of an air raid was the only cover thick enough to hide an abduction. Thorne spent 2 days observing the villa from a wooded ridge nearby. He memorized the guard rotations. He watched the SS officers come and go. He saw Dr. Cross once, a frail man standing by the window, looking out at the gray sky with a haunted expression. The man looked ready to break. On the third night, the sirens began to wail. It started as a low moan in the distance, quickly joined by dozens of others, creating a dissonant symphony of terror. Achtung! Achtung! The searchlights pierced the clouds. The flak guns opened up, a rhythmic thump-thump-thump that shook the ground. This was the signal. While the civilians ran for the shelters, Thorne moved toward the villa. The guards were distracted, looking up at the sky, worried about their own survival. Thorne breached the perimeter fence using wire cutters, moving through the ornamental garden. The noise of the anti-aircraft fire was deafening, masking the sound of his footsteps. He reached the back door. It was locked. He used a glass cutter to score a circle in the window pane, taped it to prevent it from falling, and cracked it open. He reached in and turned the handle. He was inside the kitchen. The house was dark, but he could hear voices in the front room. The guards were arguing about the bombing coordinates. Thorne moved silently down the hallway, the Mauser pistol in his hand. He knew Cross's study was on the first floor. He climbed the stairs, skipping the third step which he had observed the maid stepping over, a telltale sign of a squeaky board. He found the study. Dr. Cross was there, stuffing papers into a briefcase. The man jumped when Thorne entered. Thorne put a finger to his lips and holstered his weapon, showing his open hands. "Dr. Cross," Thorne whispered in German, "I am a friend of the lady from the cinema. We are leaving. Now." Cross looked at him, his eyes wide with fear. "You are American? You are insane. The SD is downstairs. They will kill us both." "They are busy watching the sky," Thorne replied. "Grab your research. Leave the rest." As Cross fumbled with his papers, the front door slammed open downstairs. A voice roared. "All units. Paratroopers reported in the sector. Secure the asset." Thorne cursed. The raid had triggered a heightened alert. They weren't just looking for bombers anymore. They were looking for spies. Footsteps thundered up the stairs. Thorne locked the study door and shoved a heavy oak bookshelf against it. "The window," Thorne ordered. "It's too high." Cross stammered. "It's better than the Gestapo," Thorne said, grabbing a curtain cord and tying it to the radiator. The door handle rattled violently. Then came the kick. The wood splintered. Thorne shattered the window glass with the butt of his pistol. The cold wind rushed in, carrying the smell of burning city. He lowered Cross down first. The old man landed awkwardly in the flower bed. Thorne followed, sliding down the rope, just as bullets punched through the door of the study above. They ran. They ran through the garden, into the woods, the darkness illuminated by the flashes of exploding bombs. The ground shook as a blockbuster bomb landed a mile away, the shockwave knocking them both off their feet. Thorne dragged Cross up. "Keep moving. If we stop, we die." The extraction plan had fallen apart. The designated safe house in the city center was currently burning. Thorne had to improvise. He knew of a rail yard on the outskirts, where freight trains loaded with coal were destined for Switzerland. It was a desperate, reckless idea. They navigated the burning streets of Essen. It was a nightmare landscape. Buildings were collapsing, fire brigades were shouting, and the streets were filled with glass and debris. They blended in with the refugees, Thorne smearing soot on his face, and Cross's coat to hide their identities. They looked like just two more victims of the war. They reached the rail yard at 4 a.m. The all-clear siren had sounded, leaving an eerie silence hanging over the devastation. The yard was guarded, but the chaos had thinned the ranks. Thorne spotted a train with Swiss markings. It was moving slowly, shunting onto the main line. "We have to jump," Thorne whispered. "I can't," Cross wheezed. "I am an old man." "Then you will be a dead old man," Thorne said grimly. "Run." They sprinted alongside the moving train. The wheels screeched against the tracks. A guard in a tower spotted them. A searchlight swept over the tracks, pinning them in its beam. "Halt!" A rifle shot pinged off the metal side of the wagon. Thorne grabbed Cross by the collar and heaved him onto the flatbed of a coal car. Thorne pulled himself up just as a machine gun opened fire. The bullets chewing up the gravel where his feet had been seconds before. They rolled into the coal dust, burying themselves in the black piles. The train gathered speed, chugging out of the yard, away from the fires of Essen, heading south toward the border. They lay there for hours, covered in coal dust, shivering in the freezing wind. Thorne checked his pistol. One magazine left. He looked at Cross. The scientist was clutching his briefcase like a child holding a teddy bear. Inside that briefcase were the secrets to the V2 rocket guidance system. Thorne leaned back against the cold steel of the wagon, watching the sun rise over a war-torn Europe. He lit a cigarette, his hands shaking slightly. They weren't out yet. The border checks would be brutal, but for now they were alive. The train rattled on, carrying a spy and a scientist into the uncertain future. This was only one night in a war that lasted 6 years. One mission among thousands. The men and women who fought these battles didn't wear medals. They wore shadows. Their victories were silent, and their deaths were often unrecorded. But as long as we have the files, their stories will not be forgotten. We are peeling back the layers of history, one operation at a time. If you want to see how Thorne gets across the Swiss border in the next thrilling chapter, or if you want to learn about the real-life gadgets used in these missions, hit that subscribe button. The war isn't over yet. Stay hidden, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next briefing.